As I have mentioned in other videos, early in Buddhism's history the movement had fragmented. It broke in between those who had desired stricter monastic discipline, the Staviras, and those who were happy with a continued relaxation of said discipline, the Mahasamgikas. This foreshadowed centuries of division and strife between Buddhist factions over points of metaphysics and dogma. However, as time went on, Buddhism developed three distinct sectarian flavors. One of the oldest, and probably the one that derives its orthodoxy from the Stavira split, is the Theravada Buddhist tradition. It is sterner, more orthodox, and focuses on the Sangha, and it flourished in South and Southeast Asia. In particular, it came to prominence in Sri Lanka, where it served as a Buddhist bastion in South Asia as the faith died away in the subcontinent. However, at the same time, a rival movement, possibly originating from the Mahasamgikas, was developing, called Mahayana. This means greater vehicle, and proponents of this sect often labeled Theravada as Hinayana, or lesser vehicle, as an insult. This Mahayana grouping was also the fertile soil from which the third great sectarian tradition of Buddhism, Vajrayana, or thunderbolt vehicle, esoteric Buddhism, evolved. In this video, I will explore Mahayana Buddhism and attempt to provide a framework to understand the rich, varied, and at first glance bewildering mix of doctrines, ideas, and texts which form the Mahayana tradition. As I have alluded to in the introduction, the origins of the Mahayana movement are a contested area of scholarship. Furthermore, the numerous ideas of Mahayana make it impossible to shape the movement into a coherent monolithic group. As Mahayana doctrines crossed Central Asia and entered Northeast Asia, including China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, the tradition further fragmented into the many different movements that are recognizable to Western audiences today: Chan or Zen, Tiantai, and Pure Land Buddhism. As such, I will focus on the development of Mahayana in India, up and until the eventual collapse of Buddhism in India around the 12th century CE. To do this, I will mention some key figures and ideas, but primarily I will do it through examining the huge corpus of Mahayana sutras. The Mahayana sutras are a broad genre of scriptures that the various traditions of Mahayana Buddhism accept as canonical. Unlike the Tipitaka, which is preserved in Pali text by Theravada monks in Sri Lanka, these texts are preserved primarily in the so-called Tibetan and Chinese canons, written respectively in Tibetan and Classical Chinese. Mahayana believed that the Buddha relayed these sutras to his closest disciples, or in some cases, to have them held in safekeeping by mythical semi-divine snake creatures called nagas. These texts were then supposedly transferred by oral tradition by these trusted members of the Buddha's inner circle to the emergence of the Mahayana movement. Ethic scholars, on the other hand, see these texts as comprised in the centuries following the Buddha's death and use claims of Buddha's authorship to lend credence to these new and innovative ideas. By examining these sutras, we can get a broad grasp of the new ideas that the Mahayana movement injected into the Indian intellectual tradition at this earliest stage. There is considerable disagreement as to where and when Mahayana originated. Some argue that the historical evidence points to the origin being in Andhra in southeast India. Others suggest that mentions of silk and coral could refer to a development in the northwest of the Indic world, one with deep links to China. One of the earliest indications of the Mahayana school and text comes from a 20th century cache of texts found in Gilgit in Pakistan-administered Kashmir. These manuscripts, discovered in 1931, include numerous works from this formative period of Mahayana Buddhism. One such text from this corpus, the Ajitasena Sutra, includes ideas from later Mahayana Buddhism, such as many Buddhas and Pure Lands. However, it also shows none of the contempt for the so-called Hinayana monastic practices. In fact, the text concerns the importance of dana, giving of alms to the Sangha or community of monks. This suggests that Mahayana emerged from other monastic traditions, rather than being an anti-monastic lay movement as suggested by some scholars. Adding to this fact, reports by visiting Chinese monks in the 7th century CE suggest that at this time, practices of Mahayana and Theravada lived side by side in the same monasteries. So, if in these early Mahayana texts there seems to be compatibility between Mahayana and other early Buddhist traditions, what led to the later split and acrimony between these differing traditions? One theory is that Mahayana developed from a series of cults of the book, which particular monastic sects began to congregate around shared loyalty to a new sutra text and drew on the Buddha's legitimacy to expound new ideas. However, with the Third Buddhist Council of 250 BCE and the ascension of the proto-Theravada sect called the Vibhajyavada sect to imperial power and patronage, Mahayana was set on the defensive. Hence the historical Mahayana Theravada antagonism. One of the oldest and most well-known of the Mahayana sutras is the Prana Paramita, or Perfection of Wisdom texts. This corpus of works includes two of the most famous Mahayana sutras, the Heart Sutra and the Diamond Sutra. These texts were, according to ethics scholars, composed sometime between 100 BCE and 600 CE. However, according to the traditions, they were originally teachings of the Buddha kept safe under the sea by Naga serpent demigods, who eventually revealed them to the philosopher Nagarjuna due to his suitability to receive the supposedly more advanced teachings of the Buddha. One argument that has been put forward as to the genesis of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras is that they are the answer to Abhidhamma, which was composed around 2 centuries earlier by the Savira factions. It should be noted that both of the two major schools of Mahayana Buddhist philosophy, Madhyamaka and Yogacara, attempt to synthesize Mahayana and Abhidhamma teachings. One of the key figures of the Perfection of Wisdom texts is the Bodhisattva, literally the awakened being. These are individuals who have reached a position of life without attachment, similar to the Arahant ideal of Theravada. However, they do so with the ideal of refusing complete nibbana, extinguishment, and instead turning back to the world to save others. This is the heart of the Mahayana versus so-called Hinayana debate. For Mahayana, the individual does not become a Buddha, an awakened one, for themselves, but rather for all sentient beings in the world, hence the so-called greater vehicle. Within Mahayana, there is a huge number of bodhisattvas, and they are often portrayed as the focuses of meditation and gates or bridges to salvation. Although there are literally thousands of bodhisattvas, there are a few famous ones. Maitreya, a bodhisattva associated with loving kindness, is particularly popular and has been adopted into non-Buddhist apocalyptic movements. The bodhisattva idea is not completely unique to Mahayana. In Theravada, those who are on the path to Buddhahood are often described as bodhisattvas, including previously the kings of Sri Lanka. However, in Mahayana, becoming a bodhisattva was open to all, not just the narrow sect who were on the path to arahantship in this life. Furthermore, the ideal of becoming a bodhisattva for the rest of sentient life is truly Mahayana. In one of the Perfection of Wisdom texts, known as the Perfection of Wisdom in 8,000 verses, a doctrine closely related to the Buddha and bodhisattvas is described, called the Doctrine of Three Bodies, or Trikaya. It concerns the three modes of being of the Buddha in Mahayana Buddhism. He exists in an absolute unmanifested state, the Dharmakaya, in a celestial heavenly state, the Sambhogakaya, and the physical embodiment as the flesh and blood person of Siddhartha Gautama, Nirmanakaya. This is an important idea because it not only applies to the Buddha in the form of Gautama, but in all Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. All Bodhisattvas must first manifest as fleshly forms to engage in their work of compassion in the earthly realm. Having achieved this, they then ascend to the stage of a celestial Bodhisattva, where, as a Bodhisattva, they are still able to reach back into the mundane world and help us mere mortals. Finally, all Bodhisattvas ascend to Buddhahood and being one with the primal Buddha. This idea of the eternal Buddha is actually introduced in another work, the Lotus Sutra, which I'll discuss later. The Buddha attained enlightenment in a distant past but remains to teach the Dharma over and over again, and is manifest in the many Bodhisattvas who continue to uphold these teachings. In the Doctrine of Three Bodies, we interact with the transcendent unmanifest Buddha in all meditation through the celestial Buddhas. Although this doctrine is present in the earlier Mahayana works, it isn't until the later Yogacara movement that it is systematized, which I will discuss again later. One of the most important, if not most important teaching that falls out of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras is the idea of Shunyata, which can be translated as voidness, hollowness, but is most often rendered as emptiness. Emptiness here refers to the idea that all entities, including dharmas or phenomena, are empty of an intrinsic nature or essence, and instead are conceptual constructs. In this sense, all objects are merely illusions or dreams. Here, the objects are merely impermanent and empty of true meaning. For instance, although we may perceive a tree, the tree is devoid of an inherent and lasting treeness. The tree is made up of many dharmas or phenomena which we perceive and are constantly changing, and eventually the process which we describe as tree now will morph into something which is untree-like, just as those same phenomena were not tree-like prior to its current arrangement. For Mahayana, this applies not only to physical objects and people with the similar Theravada or early Buddhist concept of no self, but also applies to Buddhist concepts of bodhisattvas, knowledge, and even nirvana or nibbana itself. The concept of emptiness was hugely influential, with one of the most famous Buddhist thinkers in Indian history and the founder of the Madhyamaka or Middle Way school, Nagarjuna. A leading skeptic in the Indic world, he himself is tightly woven into the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra tradition as the mythic recipient of the texts from the sacred Nagas. Nagarjuna and his school are incredibly important and to understand late classical and medieval Indic thought, and as such, I will cover them both in a separate video. After the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, one of the most well-known sutras is the Lotus Sutra. This sutra proposes that there are in fact three separate paths or vehicles within Buddhism, but that all these paths have the same end state, nibbana. In some ways, this is similar to the idea of the threefold yogas of the Bhagavad Gita, each unique but with the end goal of achieving moksha. The three yanas are Shravaka-yana, the vehicle of listeners, Pratyeka Buddha yana, the vehicle of the solitary awakened one, and Bodhisattvayana, the vehicle of the Bodhisattva. Shravakayana is the path taken, according to Mahayana believers, by those of weak ability, who follow the so-called lesser teachings of the Buddha and who are led to enlightenment by listening to the teachings of cultivating detachment. Pratyeka Buddhayana is the path taken by those of moderate ability and who, although still guided by the lesser teachings of the Buddha, strike out on their own path towards liberation, but once again, only for themselves. Bodhisattvayana, as you've probably guessed, is the path of Mahayana, the greater vehicle, where one follows the so-called greater teachings of the Buddha and seeks enlightenment not only for oneself, but also for all other beings. So why did the Buddha present these different paths to salvation? Well, according to the Lotus Sutra, it was because different people needed different teachings to set them on the path to liberation. This idea, called skillful means, is best explained through the parable of the burning house. In this parable, a rich man owns a huge mansion, but with only one gate to exit and enter. One time, he was outside when he sees a great blaze begin to consume the house. He knew he could escape the house through the gate, but his many sons were still in the burning house, unaware of the fire. He attempts to convince the boys to leave the house, but they are too busy with their games and unable to realize the danger of the fire. As such, he promises different toys, in the parable carts driven by goats, deer, and oxen, as a white lie to convince the boys to leave the house. Here, we see the man has taken the path of the Bodhisattva, saving others unaware of the prison they are entrapped in. The so-called lesser vehicles are the lies which are told to the children to convince them to escape into liberation. Another analogy often coupled with this story is that of the empty fist. As the man enters the room, he holds up his hand in a fist and promises his sons that he holds a great treasure inside, convincing the children to thus follow him out of the house. This particular sutra became immensely influential in the Tiantai Buddhist sect, which emerged in China around the 6th century CE. It builds heavily on the non-dualistic ideas of the transcendental form of the Buddha found in the Lotus Sutra, which I'll explore more thoroughly in a separate video. Further developing the idea of Buddhahood that emerges in the Perfection of Wisdom and Lotus Sutras is the Tathagata Garbha or Buddha Nature Sutra. There are actually several different ways that this could be translated, including Buddha embryo or Buddha womb. Buddha nature, which is discussed at length in this sutra, posits that the potentiality to attain Buddhahood is inherent within all sentient beings. It is not so much that everyone has the ability to quote-unquote aspire to Buddhahood, but rather that there is already perfect Buddhahood within the individual that one doesn't recognize because it is covered over by the imperfection of our own lives. The parable used in this idea is that of a cast metal object. Within the mold lies a perfect Buddha, already awakened. However, we only perceive the filth of the mold, which the metal of the Buddha was poured into. Thus, the act of enlightenment is realizing the Buddha nature that existed within you all along. This concept became immensely influential in later Mahayana Buddhism in East Asia and Vajrayana Buddhism, particularly in Tibet. Another important sutra for understanding the development of Mahayana is the Vimalakirti Sutra, which was likely developed sometime in the 2nd century CE. It went on to become immensely influential in East Asian Buddhism, although its impact on Indian and Tibetan Buddhism is less pronounced. The sutra addresses many of the central claims of Mahayana faith, the idea that all the world is illusion or maya, the doctrine of emptiness, and the superiority of Mahayana path over the so-called Hinayana opponents. However, the main protagonist of the sutra is Vimalakirti, a lay practitioner rather than a monk, who espouses these teachings to an audience of arahants and bodhisattvas. This elevation of the lay practitioner to someone who is capable of attaining the status of bodhisattva in this lifetime is one of the differentiating characteristics of Mahayana Buddhism. Although Mahayana never repudiates the practices of the Sangha, as evidenced by the strong monastic tradition through to the modern-day movement of Mahayana, here we possibly see the rejection of the more orthodox and austere demands of the Theravada movement and its Theravada successor. One of the side effects of this softening of the demands of monastic life was to make Mahayana Buddhism more palatable to the Sinic-influenced Confucian-dominated cultures of East Asia, to whom the more austere monastic practices were initially a barrier to localization and acceptance of the new religion. Around the 1st century CE, a new form of text called the Pure Land Sutras developed, which expanded the ideas of the celestial bodhisattvas and Buddhas with the concept of pure land. The Pure Land is the celestial realm of any one of the numerous bodhisattvas or Buddhas of the Mahayana tradition. These so-called pure abodes, which are created by the Buddha or Bodhisattva following their enlightenment. And it is from these domains that these celestial beings are able to fulfill their role in assisting others to the path of liberation. Key to the Pure Land Sutras is one particular celestial Buddha, called Amida. Amida was a monk, or possibly a former king, originally called Dharmakara, who resolved to become a Buddha and create a pure land outside of ordinary reality created by his merit and filled with perfection. As part of his vow, Dharmakara stated that anyone who called upon his name, even as few as 10 times, would be guaranteed rebirth in his Pure Land, from where they could pursue liberation at a more tranquil and heavenly existence. This sutra became extremely important in later Pure Land Buddhism, which flourished in East Asia. With a distinctly more evangelistic flavor than other forms of Buddhism, Pure Land calls on individuals to devote themselves to Amida in a hope of rebirth in his Pure Land, rather than the more orthodox attempts to achieve bodhisattva status through liberation from attachment, aversion, and ignorance. Following the Lotus and Pure Land Sutras, one of the most important sectarian sutras in Mahayana is the Avatamsaka Sutra, which originates from around the 2nd century CE, but reached its final form probably around the 4th century. It is often translated as the Flower Garland Sutra. The sutra, one of the longest in the Mahayana canon, deals with numerous topics. However, it is characterized by a grand cosmology that encompasses both the path of bodhisattva and the nature of reality. Sometimes used as an independent sutra, a portion of the flower garland called the 10 Stages Sutra details the 10 stages which a bodhisattva must undergo to achieve enlightenment. Part of this is the cultivation of an enlightened mind, or bodhicitta, which strives towards awakening, empathy, and compassion for the benefit of all sentient beings. The text also extends the idea of dependent origination from pre-sectarian Buddhism. Dependent origination is the idea that all dharmas, as in phenomena, are dependent on other dharmas to exist. The Flower Garland Sutra takes this further and argues that all phenomena are interconnected due to their mutual arising. As such, every phenomenon contains all other phenomena within it. This mutual dependence is called interpenetration. The metaphor which is used to describe interpenetration within the sutra is called Indra's net. Indra, the Vedic god, has a net which is set with jewels. In each jewel is reflected the image of all other jewels in the net, but within the reflected jewels is also reflected the reflections of all other jewels, and so on ad infinitum. The ideas of the Flower Garland Sutra would become incredibly important for the Huayan school of Buddhism, which would develop in China sometime in the 5th century CE. The second of the two early important schools of Mahayana thought, called Yogacara, originates from the so-called Third Turning Sutras. The school, by tradition founded by the Bodhisattva Maitreya but systematized by the brothers Asanga and Vasubandhu, focuses on the idea of representation only, or Vinapti Matra. Traditionally, these sutras and the Yogacara school have been taken to mean that the reality a human being perceives does not exist, any more than the images called up by monks in meditation exist. Only the consciousness that one has of the momentary interconnected events, or dharmas, that make up the cosmic flux can be said to exist. There is considerable scholarly debate as to what representation only means. For some, this is a strong idealism where only the mind exists and there is no physical reality with which the mind interacts. On the other hand, there are some who claim that this is realistic pluralism, in that it doesn't reject the possibility of an external world, but argues that the mind only has access to impressions created on the sensory organs and not reality itself. The reason that these sutras are called the Third Turning is in reference to the Yogacara characterization of the teachings of the Buddha as conceptualized by the school. The first turning of the wheel is the Pali Canon of Theravada. The second turning is the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras and the teachings of Nagarjuna. The third turning are these Yogacara teachings of representation only, the most sophisticated and correct, at least according to the disciples of Yogacara. In this episode, I have discussed the broad swath of intellectual and religious ideas that have formed the Indian phase of the Mahayana Buddhist tradition. To recap, the tradition emerged from the monastic mainstream with ideas concerning Bodhisattvas and Pure Lands. With the orthodox reaction under the Mauryan Empire, the Mahayana movement was forced to diverge, with the introduction of new ideas such as Buddha nature, a focus on the lay community, and the idea of emptiness that was key to the first of the early Mahayana schools, Madhyamaka. Other important texts, including the Lotus Sutra with the ideas of skillful means, which was key to Tiantai Buddhism, the Flower Garland Sutra, which is the idea of interpenetration, which is important to Huayan Buddhism, and the Pure Land Sutras, which, surprise, surprise, are the foundation of Pure Land Buddhism. Finally, the ideas of representation only, a contentious term which could represent a form of Buddhist idealism or qualified realism, is expounded in the Third Turning Sutras, which form the base of the second of the early Mahayana schools, Yogacara. Mahayana thrived until the collapse of Buddhism in India between the 10th and 12th century CE, but survived in East Asia where it split into the many modern sects of Mahayana, which are familiar to Western readers, such as Zen, and also formed the basis of the third great tradition of Buddhism which co-developed with Theravada and Mahayana, the esoteric Vajrayana, which came to dominate in Tibet.